In the winter of 1847, Millbrook, Kentucky uncovered a horror that would shadow the Ohio River Valley for generations. Beneath the respected Sullivan Medical Institute lay hidden chambers filled with the preserved remains of over 60 missing men, women, and children from the past 15 years. Detailed surgical notes in Dr. Cornelius Sullivan's precise handwriting described procedures so grotesque they defied the ethics of any civilized physician. Many victims had sought help for nothing more than headaches, stomach aches, or sleeplessness conditions that should never have warranted such radical interventions. The Kentucky State Medical Board buried the full report, locking the truth away for nearly 2 centuries. Before the scandal, the Sullivan name was revered in Millbrook, a quiet riverside town founded in 1823 and thriving by 1832 with nearly 800 residents. Its pride rested on a brick courthouse, a towering Methodist church, and most of all, the Sullivan Medical Institute. Sullivan had arrived in 1831, a distinguished man in his 40s with silver-streaked hair, claiming training from the finest medical colleges in Philadelphia and Edinburgh. Within months, he opened a grand 3-story facility complete with patient rooms, a surgical theater, and a basement laboratory. He rejected the crude bloodletting of frontier doctors, instead promoting revolutionary treatments rooted in anatomical study and neural intervention, achieving seemingly miraculous recoveries. He lived quietly above the institute with his daughter Margaret, a pale and reserved girl who assisted in his work. The townspeople never questioned why so many of his patients came from outside the community. Transients, drifters, and the socially isolated, nor why some were never seen again. Suspicion first surfaced in October 1846, when merchant Thomas Hendris told Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael that his brother Robert, suffering from post-accident headaches, had been admitted for a 2-week program and hadn't been seen in 6. Dr. Sullivan insisted the treatment required complete isolation. But when Carmichael visited unannounced, he noticed Margaret mopping a floor with water tinged brown and a sharp odor of decay rising from the basement. That night, the sheriff returned in secret and peered through a basement window. Inside, Dr. Sullivan, wearing a blood-stained apron, methodically dissected human tissue under lamplight, surrounded by jars of preserved organs and tables holding shrouded forms. The body on the table had Robert's distinctive red hair and build. News spread quickly, but instead of outrage, many defended Sullivan, citing his countless cures and accusing the sheriff of bias. Confronted by the town council, Sullivan calmly claimed his specimens were legally purchased cadavers and that Robert had died of brain fever despite his best efforts. Dr. Sullivan explained that Robert's body had been preserved until the family could be notified, admitting he had delayed the news in the hope that his research might lead to a breakthrough for similar cases. He spoke to the town council with what seemed like sincere regret, insisting that every procedure was done in the name of advancing medical understanding. If his work appeared unconventional, it was only because traditional medicine had failed too many. The council voted to let him continue under stricter oversight, requiring detailed patient records. Most residents accepted this as proof of his innocence, but Sheriff Carmichael remained unconvinced. He had seen too much, and Robert Hendris's death marked the start of his own investigation. Over the months that followed, Carmichael discovered disturbing patterns between 1832 and 1846. 37 patients were admitted for extended treatment, and only 14 returned. The rest were reported dead, often travelers, seasonal workers, or people from far-off towns, making it unlikely anyone would confirm the claims. Sullivan maintained extensive correspondence with medical colleges in Louisville, Cincinnati, and Baltimore, purchasing advanced surgical tools and supplies far beyond what a small-town practice required. His financial records showed regular payments to unidentified suppliers, labeled only as research materials or anatomical specimens. Most troubling, he advertised in regional newspapers, targeting patients with chronic illnesses, mental disorders, or hopeless diagnoses, offering revolutionary European treatments and encouraging long-term stays. As winter deepened, families from across the region came to Carmichael with stories of loved ones who vanished after entering Sullivan's care. Riverboat captain Samuel Turner described how his 19-year-old son, David, suffering from melancholia, traveled to Millbrook in August 1845 after seeing one of Sullivan's ads. He received one letter dictated by the doctor saying treatment was going well. Then, nothing. Turner's attempts to see his son were met with excuses and forged letters. Eventually, Sullivan claimed David had been transferred to Louisville, but no institution there had ever heard of him. Mrs. Eleanor Dawson told a similar story. Her daughter Catherine went to Sullivan for female hysteria in 1844 and wrote that she was learning anatomy to assist him, an impossibility since she fainted at the sight of blood. After 2 letters, all communication stopped. In each case, the pattern was the same hopeful departure, reassuring letters, dwindling contact, and an unverifiable report of death or transfer. Carmichael saw the design. Sullivan preyed on desperate patients whose distant families could not visit often, then hid their disappearances behind credible-sounding medical narratives. But the sheriff suspected something even larger, that the basement he had glimpsed was only part of the operation. The building could house far more, and Sullivan's daughter Margaret likely knew more than she admitted. In February, Carmichael returned to the Institute with Deputy James Whitfield and Dr. Augustus Brennan, a retired Army surgeon who distrusted Sullivan's methods. Just past midnight, they entered through a rear service door with a key from the original contractor. Inside, the air reeked of formaldehyde mixed with rot. Dark stains marked the floors, and faint noises echoed from below, metal scraping glass, clinking low voices. Brennan inspected patient rooms and found barred windows, iron manacles, and beds fitted with heavy leather restraints. "These aren't treatment rooms," he whispered. "They're prison cells." In Sullivan's office, Carmichael found a locked cabinet containing patient files filled with anatomical sketches, bone measurements, and detailed notes on experiments ranging from organ removal to cerebral mapping via direct brain tissue examination. Robert Hendriss's file contained 17 pages of notes detailing surgical procedures performed while he was allegedly conscious, documenting in clinical precision how different areas of the brain reacted to direct stimulation. Sullivan had even recorded Robert's verbal responses, building what amounted to a systematic map of human consciousness and pain. But it was the file on Margaret Sullivan that revealed the most harrowing truth. She was labeled not as a patient, but as primary research assistant subject M. The records showed her father had been experimenting on her since arriving in Millbrook, subjecting her to surgeries meant to test his theories on anatomy and psychology. The notes described scars across her body, her reactions to chemicals and drugs, and plans for future procedures to refine the integration of surgical modification with neurological function. Margaret was not simply his assistant. She was his most altered and successful creation, shaped into a living instrument for his research. Behind a hidden door in Sullivan's office, Deputy Whitfield found a narrow stairway to the basement. As they descended, the chemical stench grew stronger, and the faint sounds below sharpened into clinking glass, metal scraping, and murmured voices. The basement stretched across the entire foundation, divided into chambers linked by tight corridors. The main surgical suite held 4 restraint-equipped tables surrounded by glass cases displaying preserved human organs. Anatomical charts on the walls were marked with numbered sections, explaining the most efficient surgical approaches to each part of the body. In the preservation chamber, Carmichael counted 43 containers each, holding harvested organs in chemical suspension. Labeled with dates and patient initials, a gruesome index of Sullivan's work. Some jars contained entire limbs. Others displayed dissected organs, frozen mid-study. Most chilling was the neurological research chamber, where 12 human heads floated in preservative, each accompanied by charts mapping the brain regions Sullivan had explored. The preservation was so flawless that victims were recognizable: David Turner's cleft chin, Catherine Dawson's dark hair framing her preserved face. As Brennan examined the surgical notes, footsteps approached from above. Sullivan appeared, lamp in hand, wearing the same blood-stained leather apron Carmichael had seen months before. Margaret followed her movements, strangely deliberate, as though her body operated under conscious command rather than instinct. Sullivan set the lamp down and addressed them with calm disappointment, accusing the sheriff of forcing his hand. Margaret silently blocked the only exit, while her father spoke with clinical detachment, urging them to see his work not as horror, but as groundbreaking research that would reduce human suffering. Carmichael's eyes caught the surgical instruments laid out nearby: scalpels, bone saws, clamps, and bizarre devices for procedures no legitimate doctor would consider arranged with obsessive care. Whitfield's steady despite the scene reminded Sullivan that these people had come to him for help. Sullivan's face lit with enthusiasm. "And what magnificent trust it was," he said, before explaining that cadavers were worthless compared to the living subjects who allowed him to observe physiology, neurology, and psychology in real time. Moving to a jar containing a human liver, he described how it had come from a farmer suffering from chronic fatigue, and how, while the man remained conscious, Sullivan had mapped the connection between liver function and energy levels in unprecedented detail. Sullivan spoke with pride, as if the suffering around him were nothing more than data points. He insisted that Robert Hendriss's work in the fields could never match the contributions he made to medical science under Sullivan's care. Dr. Brennan, his face tight with restraint, told him plainly this was not research, but systematic torture. Sullivan dismissed the accusation, claiming pain was simply a neurological signal that could be altered through proper intervention. To prove his point, he gestured to Margaret, who rolled up her sleeve to reveal a lattice of surgical scars. With deliberate care, Sullivan drew a scalpel across one, and Margaret's face remained perfectly still. He explained that 15 years of nerve pathway modifications and chemical treatments had removed her capacity for physical pain while preserving her intellect, making her the ideal surgical assistant. Margaret, speaking with eerie calm, confirmed that her father had told her temporary discomfort was necessary to achieve optimal functionality, and that she now performed complex procedures without emotional disturbance. Carmichael realized that Margaret's withdrawn demeanor had masked something far worse. Her father had surgically stripped her of normal human emotion. Sullivan's excitement grew as he described eliminating specific feelings, enhancing pain tolerance, and altering undesirable personality traits. He led them to a section of the lab where advanced restraint tables were fitted with mechanisms for precise positioning and equipment to monitor vital signs during long operations. He opened a journal and cited the case of David Turner, the melancholic young man from Madison. Sullivan had explored his brain while David remained awake, mapping pathways linked to sadness and optimizing them to remove depressive responses entirely. When Brennan demanded to know if he was admitting to performing brain surgery on conscious patients, Sullivan called it neurological optimization and insisted that awareness was essential for meaningful results. Meanwhile, Deputy Whitfield, searching the lab, pushed past a curtain into a hidden chamber and froze. 6 living patients lay secured to tables, all partially conscious, but unable to speak or move normally. Their heads were shaved, fresh surgical wounds stitched and bandaged, their eyes locked on the intruders with silent desperation. Sullivan followed, and with satisfaction introduced them as his current research subjects, each part of an active study in consciousness, pain, and behavior control. He pointed to a middle-aged man who had arrived for chronic insomnia and had since undergone surgeries to remove his need for sleep, though his mental faculties had suffered. The man tried to speak, but produced only broken guttural sounds, his vocal cords damaged by surgery. Moving to a young woman, Sullivan explained that she had come for anxiety and was now partway through a series of amygdala modifications intended to remove fear while keeping other emotions intact. Carmichael understood the full scope. Now, this wasn't just the aftermath of past crimes. Sullivan's operation was ongoing. The so-called research was still in motion, its subjects alive, restrained, and enduring endless procedures. Margaret adjusted straps on one of the tables with a detached precision, as though she were positioning surgical tools rather than human beings. Her father noted her value in sustaining long-term protocols, monitoring vitals, maintaining wounds, and assisting with surgeries, all without the emotional interference that compassion might bring. Sullivan declared that Margaret embodied the future of medicine physicians, unburdened by sentiment, able to pursue research without concern for patient comfort. Dr. Brennan moved toward a young woman restrained on one of the tables, her wide, terrified eyes silently begging for help. The wounds on her skull bore the marks of repeated surgeries, evidence of months of invasive procedures. Brennan demanded to know how long these people had been held. Sullivan, with pride, consulted his journals and revealed that his longest-term subject had been under his care for nearly 8 months, allowing him to chart the progressive effects of neurological modification in unparalleled detail. Brennan read the chart of the woman before him, subject N61. Catherine, once in her early 20s, dark-haired and likely beautiful, before her head was reshaped by the surgeon's tools. She had first come to the institute seeking relief from migraine headaches. Sullivan explained that her case had been an ideal opportunity to study pain perception, and he had methodically altered her neural pathways to eliminate certain types of pain while leaving others intact. Catherine was fully aware of her surroundings, but could neither speak nor control her facial expressions, trapped inside a body disconnected from her will. Carmichael felt a deep sickness as he realized that Sullivan's cruelty went beyond killing his victims, were kept alive, conscious, and systematically dismantled both physically and mentally over weeks or months. Sullivan then turned his attention to the 3 intruders, speaking as if outlining a research plan. Carmichael, he said, could provide valuable data on the neurological foundations of leadership, especially if moral constraints were removed. Whitfield, with his law enforcement conditioning, was perfect for pain threshold experiments and behavioral control trials. Brennan, as a military surgeon, would be the ideal candidate for techniques designed to strip battlefield physicians of emotional responses to trauma, enabling them to work with absolute detachment. Sullivan envisioned a future where empathy, fear, and moral hesitation were surgically excised from medicine, leaving only cold, unflinching efficiency. When Carmichael made a move toward the exit, Margaret intercepted him with alarming precision, wielding surgical instruments like weapons. Her every motion was economical, controlled, and utterly without hesitation. Her father had conditioned her to defend the laboratory as fiercely as she aided in experiments. Brennan managed to free Catherine, but the woman's altered nervous system left her unable to move effectively. She remained a conscious witness, locked in a body that would not obey her. Sullivan fought with a frenzy that matched his conviction, narrating his techniques, even as he struggled, raging that his work would one day be hailed as the foundation of true scientific medicine. Whitfield forced him into restraints, but Sullivan continued shouting about the ignorance of those who could not see the genius before them. Margaret, once captured, required her own set of restraints, and in the process, the depth of her father's modifications became horrifyingly clear. She reacted to her capture not with fear or rage, but with the same cold, mechanical focus she had shown in surgery, her humanity erased in the name of her father's vision. Margaret Sullivan felt no fear, anger, or distress when she was taken into custody. Instead, she calmly assessed the situation and began outlining ways to continue her father's work from memory, proving that his modifications had erased her capacity for normal emotional responses while leaving her intellect and medical training fully intact. The investigation into the Sullivan Medical Institute required cooperation between local authorities. State officials, federal marshals, and medical specialists from multiple universities. The operation's complexity demanded expert analysis to understand both the scale of Sullivan's crimes and the extent of his victims' injuries. Dr. Marcus Fitzgerald, a leading neurologist from the University of Louisville, spent weeks studying Sullivan's research notes. His preliminary findings described surgical procedures that demonstrated advanced knowledge of neurological function, but an absolute disregard for human welfare. The confirmed victim count reached 89 ages, ranging from 14 to 67, hailing from multiple states across the Ohio River Valley. Sullivan's advertisements had lured patients from far-off communities, reducing the chance that family members would visit or investigate. His meticulously kept records documented 17 years of evolving experiments, beginning with unconventional but genuine treatments before descending into deliberate systematic torture. These journals outlined a methodical process for acquiring victims, including letters crafted to deter family visits, forged correspondence in the patient's handwriting, and protocols for body disposal when subjects died during procedures. Of the 6 living patients recovered from the laboratory, only 3 survived long enough to speak to investigators, and none regained full function. Their accounts became key evidence. Catherine Morrison, Catherine, who had come for migraine treatment, lived 6 weeks after rescue. In lucid moments, she described in written notes how Sullivan had performed repeated brain surgeries, while keeping her awake, demanding she describe each sensation. When she cried or begged him to stop, he told her emotions were impeding science. He restrained her mechanically used chemicals to maintain consciousness and carried out procedures over months, each targeting different brain functions. Thomas Beckwith, a 34-year-old miller from Brandenburg, came seeking relief for chronic back pain, but was instead subjected to experiments on pain transmission. He wrote that each procedure was promised as the last, but Sullivan always found another theory to test until Beckwith understood he was nothing more than a living model for neurological study. The third survivor, 17-year-old Elizabeth Harden of Owensboro, revealed that Sullivan sought out younger patients for the resilience of their brain tissue. She described him performing experiments on others in her presence, explaining his belief that sadness and fear were malfunctions to be corrected through surgery, creating people optimized for productivity without negative emotions. Margaret Sullivan proved the most challenging case for medical experts. Dr. Fitzgerald reported that her father had begun operating on her around age 8, first eliminating pain and anxiety, then removing sympathy and moral hesitation. She spoke of these modifications in court with the same cold precision her father had shown, offering detailed accounts of restraining patients, monitoring vital signs, and disposing of bodies without any recognition that these acts were crimes. Her testimony confirmed she had become an instrument of her father's research, capable of assisting in murder and torture with clinical detachment. The trial lasted 8 months and pushed the legal system into unfamiliar territory. Prosecutors argued that Sullivan's medical credentials could not shield him from murder charges, while his defense claimed his actions were misguided but driven by genuine scientific intent. On the stand, Sullivan was unapologetic, describing his methods in detail and dismissing moral objections as sentimental obstacles to progress. He maintained that his patient's suffering was justified by the breakthroughs it had produced. In his final statement, he insisted their sacrifices will be vindicated when future physicians use the knowledge gained through this research to eliminate suffering for countless patients. The jury found Dr. Cornelius Sullivan guilty on 87 counts of first-degree murder, making his trial one of the most extensive serial murder cases in American legal history. The judge sentenced him to death. In the months before his execution, Sullivan devoted himself to writing a 400-page memoir, meticulously detailing his methods, his theories, and his hopes that future scientists would continue his work. Far from exonerating him, the memoirs added to the mountain of evidence against him, revealing the deliberate structure of his operation. Financial records showing payments to suppliers across multiple states, correspondence with medical distributors in Louisville, Cincinnati, Baltimore, and New York, and a network of professional contacts who may have knowingly provided him with unusual chemicals and specialized surgical equipment. Investigators found letters in which Sullivan discussed experimental findings with other physicians, omitting the horrific methods by which his data had been obtained. Some correspondence hinted at a broader subculture of doctors engaged in similar, unauthorized research. A federal inquiry expanded the case, identifying 3 other practitioners whose records and equipment suggested disturbing parallels to Sullivan's work. Dr. Edmund Forrester of Nashville had purchased similar laboratory equipment and was found in possession of preserved human organs and surgical notes implying post-mortem and possibly live experimental procedures. Dr. William Chandler of Lexington had corresponded with Sullivan about neurological modification techniques and maintained suspiciously high mortality rates for patients with minor ailments, though he died of a heart attack before charges could be filed. Most troubling was Dr. Harrison Blackstone of Louisville, who operated a private hospital for mental and neurological disorders. His patients' families received consistent updates, and his mortality rates seemed ordinary. But an examination of his records revealed patterns of experimental surgeries designed to test theories rather than treat illnesses. These discoveries suggested that Sullivan's crimes were not the work of an isolated madman, but part of a loosely connected network of physicians abusing their credentials for human experimentation. Margaret Sullivan spent the rest of her life at the Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane. Specialists from several universities studied her condition under the supervision of Dr. Samuel Patterson, the hospital's medical director. Patterson reported that her father's years of surgeries had stripped her of normal emotional responses while preserving intellect, memory, and technical skill. She could describe complex medical procedures in detail, yet she displayed no understanding of why such actions might be considered immoral. Margaret lived until 1903, never developing normal emotional capacity. Though she occasionally provided valuable insights into brain function, her case became both a milestone in early neuroscience and a stark warning of how medical knowledge could be twisted toward cruelty. In March 1847, the Sullivan Medical Institute burned to the ground. The basement laboratory, soaked with decades' worth of chemical preservatives, proved nearly impossible to destroy. The fire burned with strange, unnatural colors, releasing toxic smoke that forced the town to evacuate. Even after the flames were extinguished, the site remained contaminated, the poisoned soil unable to sustain vegetation. The land was declared unsafe for building and permanently abandoned. For the families of Sullivan's victims, the ordeal did not end with his execution. His precise records meant they could read the exact clinical descriptions of how their loved ones had suffered in many cases for months or years before dying on his tables. The weight of shame, anger, and grief drove some to leave their communities, entirely unable to live among neighbors who had once defended the doctor. Samuel Turner, whose son David had been among Sullivan's victims, dedicated the rest of his life to advocating for laws that would regulate experimental medicine and require mandatory reporting of patient deaths. His testimony before the Kentucky legislature became a key influence in the creation of early patient protection statutes, one of the few lasting safeguards born from one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Samuel Turner's voice carried both grief and determination when he testified that his son had trusted Dr. Sullivan out of desperation. And because the community had accepted Sullivan's credentials without question, we must ensure that no other families suffer, because physicians are allowed to operate without adequate oversight or accountability, he said. In the aftermath, the Kentucky State Medical Board enacted sweeping reforms, requiring experimental medical procedures to be reviewed by formal medical boards and mandating the reporting of any research involving human subjects. These measures would serve as a blueprint for similar regulations across the country and lay groundwork for the ethical standards that guide modern medicine. Yet much of Sullivan's work remained locked away. For over a century, the full details of his methods were sealed in state archives, with officials arguing that releasing them might inspire dangerous imitators or provide technical knowledge to unscrupulous practitioners. Meanwhile, Millbrook itself never recovered. Its population dwindled as residents fled the lingering shadow of the scandal, and by 1860, fewer than 200 people remained. Main Street was lined with boarded-up storefronts, and the plot where the Sullivan Medical Institute once stood became a barren, scar soil poisoned by years of chemical contamination, shunned by both humans and animals. Locals whispered of strange smells, faint noises, and an oppressive unease that clung to anyone who lingered near the site, cementing its reputation as cursed ground. The Sullivan case revealed how a respected reputation, geographic isolation, and systemic deception could enable crimes on a staggering scale. In an era with slow communication, minimal oversight, and an almost unshakable trust in professional authority, Sullivan exploited the hopes of families desperate for cures, concealing his crimes behind the facade of medical innovation. His standing in the community shielded him from suspicion, silencing concerns about missing patients and discouraging relatives from questioning his word. Historians and criminologists now study the case as a stark warning. It directly influenced the creation of informed consent laws, the establishment of medical review boards, and the strict regulation of experimental treatments, measures that remain central to patient protection today. The psychological profiles prepared during his trial offered early insight into how individuals could commit atrocities while maintaining a mask of professionalism and moral detachment. But the story leaves unsettling questions. Evidence hinted that Sullivan was not an isolated figure, but part of a wider network of medical criminals. Some of his contacts, other physicians with suspicious practices, were investigated. Yet it's unclear how many others might have quietly adopted his techniques and evaded detection. Did his methods truly end with his death? Or did they live on in secret, passed quietly from one unethical practitioner to another? That lingering uncertainty is what keeps the Sullivan case alive in the public imagination. A reminder that authority must always be held accountable, and that trust without scrutiny can open the door to horrors hidden in plain sight.